The first king in history did not sit on a golden throne. He did not rule an empire with marble palaces, royal portraits, or armies marching under silk banners. He lived in a world of mud brick walls, reed boats, temple courtyards, canals, barley fields, and city-states, fighting for power under the burning sun of ancient Mesopotamia. And the strange thing is this: the people who wrote down the first kings did not begin with normal men. They began with kings who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years. Kings who came before a great flood. Kings whose reigns sound less like history and more like memory, myth, and political propaganda fused into one. But buried beneath those impossible names, beneath the legends of Eridu, Kish, Uruk, and the gods sending kingship down from heaven, one name begins to feel different. Enmebaragesi, king of Kish. A man who may be the earliest ruler in the Sumerian King List, whose name is supported by real inscriptions, not just later legend. Britannica describes Enmebaragesi as king of Kish and one of Mesopotamia's first historical personalities, flourishing around 2700 BC. So, was he the first king in history? The answer depends on what we mean by king. Because before kings had crowns, they had something more dangerous. They had control. Control over grain, control over labor, control over temples, control over war, control over who ate, who worked, who fought, and who was remembered. Long before Egypt had its great pyramids, long before Babylon became legendary, long before Rome was even a village, southern Mesopotamia was already becoming something humanity had never seen before. Not just villages, cities, and once cities appeared, one question became unavoidable. Who gets to command everyone else? At first, early human communities did not need kings in the way later civilizations understood them. A small band of hunter-gatherers could make decisions through elders, family networks, reputation, and survival skill. If one person became too controlling, people could leave, but cities changed everything. You cannot simply walk away from irrigation canals that took generations to build. You cannot abandon grain stores when thousands of people depend on them. You cannot let every family decide alone when floodwaters must be controlled, walls must be repaired, fields must be divided, and enemies may attack. Agriculture created surplus. Surplus created storage. Storage created management. Management created power. And power needed a face. In ancient Sumer, that face may first have belonged to temple authorities, priests, administrators, and local elites. The earliest cities were not ruled like modern nations. They were living systems of ritual, food production, labor organization, and divine authority. The temple was not just a religious building. It was an economic machine. It collected grain. It organized workers. It owned land. It gave offerings to gods and rations to people. It linked survival to belief. And in that world, the gods were not distant ideas. They were treated almost like invisible rulers of the city. A city belonged to its god, and humans were there to serve, build, farm, fight, and maintain cosmic order. But as cities grew richer, they also became more vulnerable. More grain meant more thieves. More land meant more disputes. More people meant more conflict. More cities meant more war. At some point, authority had to become sharper, not just sacred, military, administrative, personal. This is where the king begins to emerge, not as a fairy tale monarch, but as a crisis manager with weapons. A man who could organize workers, lead armies, command loyalty, and claim that his power was not merely human, it was approved by the gods. The Sumerians had a word connected with kingship, lugal, often translated as king, literally meaning something like big man. That phrase alone tells you something. The first king may not have been born as a king. He may have become one by becoming the biggest man in the room, the strongest protector, the richest organizer, the one who could gather men behind him when danger came, the one who could turn temporary emergency power into permanent rule. And then came the story the Sumerians told about kingship itself. In the Sumerian King List, kingship is not invented by humans. It descends from heaven. The list begins with mythical rulers before the flood, including Alulim of Eridu, whose reign is given as an impossible 28,800 years. Modern scholarship treats these early antediluvian rulers as legendary rather than historically verified. That matters, because Alulim may be called the first king in the Sumerian tradition, but he is not the first king we can confidently treat as a real historical person. He belongs to the misty borderland between sacred memory and political myth. The Sumerians were not simply recording history the way we do today. They were explaining why power existed. They were saying, kingship is not random, it is cosmic, it is ancient, it comes from above. And that idea is one of the most powerful political inventions in human history. Because once people believe kingship descends from heaven, resisting a king becomes more than rebellion. It becomes rebellion against order itself. After the flood in the Sumerian King List, kingship moves to Kish. This is important because Kish became a symbol of legitimate rule. Later rulers sometimes claimed the title King of Kish, even when they did not literally rule only Kish, because the title carried prestige. Kish was not just a city, it became an idea. The place where kingship, after chaos, returned to earth. And among the kings of Kish, one name stands out from the fog. Enmebaragesi. He is not the first name on the list. He is not the most famous. He does not have the mythic glamour of Gilgamesh. But historically, he may be more important. Because Enmebaragesi is linked to actual inscriptions, Britannica notes that he is the oldest Mesopotamian ruler from whom authentic inscriptions are known, including vase fragments. That is the turning point. With him, we move from people later said this king existed to this name appears in material evidence. It is like history suddenly stops whispering and leaves a fingerprint, a fragment, a name, a title, a ruler whose existence breaks through the clay. So what do we know about him? Not much, and that makes him even more haunting. Enmebaragesi ruled Kish around the early 3rd millennium BC, often placed around 2700 BC. He appears in the Sumerian King List, where he is credited with defeating or subduing Elam. The King List also connects him to Aga of Kish, his son and successor, who appears in the story of Gilgamesh and Aga. Think about that world. Kish, rising on the Mesopotamian plain, canals cutting through the land, farmers bent over barley fields, scribes pressing signs into wet clay, priests performing rituals in temple spaces, warriors carrying spears and shields, and somewhere above this system, a ruler whose name survives not because people loved him, but because power needed to be recorded. This is one of the deepest truths about early kingship. Kings were not remembered because they were kind. They were remembered because they controlled enough people, land, labor, and violence that writing had to serve them. Writing itself may not have begun as poetry or philosophy. It began largely with accounting, grain, sheep, labor, offerings, storage, debt, temple goods. And once writing could track property, it could also preserve authority. A king's name on an object was not decoration. It was a claim. This belongs to power. This was made under power. This ruler existed. That is why Enmebaragesi matters. He stands at the edge of the first great human transformation, the moment leadership becomes institution. Before him, there were chiefs, elders, war leaders, priests, clan heads, and powerful men whose names are lost forever. Some may have ruled earlier than he did. In Egypt, early rulers before the first dynasty were already building political power. In Mesopotamia, earlier city leaders almost certainly existed before Enmebaragesi. But the problem is evidence. History is not just what happened. History is what survived. And for the earliest kings, survival depends on clay, stone, inscriptions, and later lists copied by scribes centuries afterward. So when we ask, who was the first king in history, we are really asking three different questions. Who was the first king according to myth? The answer may be Alulim, the first ruler named in the Sumerian King List, said to have ruled Eridu before the flood. Who was the first real king ever to exist? We do not know. That person lived before surviving records, and his name is gone. Who was one of the earliest historically attested kings whose name we can still point to? That is where Enmebaragesi of Kish becomes one of the strongest answers. But the bigger story is not just his name. It is what he represents. Before kingship, power was personal and flexible. After kingship, power became permanent. It could outlive the man. It could pass to sons. It could attach itself to cities, temples, titles, armies, and gods. The king became more than a leader. He became the center of a machine. And that machine changed everything. Because once one city had a king, other cities needed kings too. A city with only priests and elders might struggle against a city with a war leader who could mobilize hundreds of men quickly. A city with no central command might fall behind a city that could organize canals, store grain, and build walls with brutal efficiency. Kingship spread not only because people believed in it. It spread because it worked, at least for those at the top. For ordinary people, the first kings were probably both protectors and predators. A king could defend your city from attack, but he could also demand your labor. He could build irrigation systems that kept your children alive, but he could also send your sons to war. He could organize food during famine, but he could also tax the grain you grew. He could turn chaos into order, but order always had a price. This is the dark bargain at the birth of civilization. Humans gained cities, walls, law, writing, trade, and monumental building. But they also gained hierarchy, forced labor, organized war, taxation, and rulers who claimed their authority came from heaven. The first king was not just a man. He was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat in Egypt, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, China, Mesoamerica, and almost every civilization that followed. A single figure rises above the crowd. He says he protects the people. He says the gods favor him. He says the land needs order. He says enemies are coming. He says the city must obey. And slowly, what began as survival becomes government. What began as leadership becomes monarchy. What began as one powerful man becomes a throne. But Enmebaragesi's world was still raw. He was not a king of a nation-state in the modern sense. He ruled in a landscape of competing Sumerian city-states, where cities like Kish, Uruk, Ur, and others fought for prestige and control. The Sumerian King List itself is complicated, with different versions and legendary reign lengths, so scholars use it cautiously rather than as a simple factual timeline. That caution is important. We should not pretend the evidence is cleaner than it is. The first king in history is not a simple answer carved in stone. It is a shadow cast by fragments. Alulim is the first king of legend. Enmebaragesi is among the first kings of evidence. And between them lies the birth of political power. One belongs to the sacred imagination of early Mesopotamia. The other stands closer to history, with a name that archaeology can touch. But maybe the most important thing is this. The first king was not important because he wore a crown. He was important because people began to accept that one human being could stand above thousands of others and command their labor, their food, their loyalty, and sometimes their lives. That idea did not die in ancient Kish. It grew. It built pyramids. It raised ziggurats. It marched armies. It wrote laws. It created empires. It collapsed cities. It made history possible and made history dangerous. So who was the first king in history? If you ask the ancient Sumerians, they might point beyond history, to Alulim, to Eridu, to kingship descending from heaven before the flood. If you ask archaeology, one of the strongest names is Enmebaragesi of Kish, a ruler standing at the edge where myth begins to harden into record. But if you ask what the first king truly was, the answer is more disturbing. He was the moment humanity learned to turn survival into hierarchy, the moment a city became more than houses and walls, the moment power found a name. And thousands of years later, we are still living inside the world that first kings created.